Thank you very much for being here and having accepted the invitation to present and discuss with us. So John, the stage is yours.
Okay, great.
Sharing the screen, I guess. So, yes.
Yes, I'll share my screen in just a minute. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the invitation. Great to see so many new faces and to get to know you all and the work that you're doing in Tallinn. I was really happy to get the invitation because I thought, oh wow, it was like kindred spirits in places I didn't expect them. So that was a really nice invitation to get. So thank you. And like I said, this is a way for me to get back into the academic year also and to start thinking about these issues again. So yeah, let me share my screen because I have some slides to show. Here we go. This should do it. Can everybody see it? Actually, I can't see it.
No, we can't see it either.
Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so the title. And thanks for Professor Schich for the kind introduction. The title of our talk is On Display: Instagram, the Self and the City. And as you'll see, that is somewhat special title for reasons I will divulge in just a minute. But first, yeah, a quick introduction also from my side. So I'm John Boy. I'm a sociologist who teaches in an anthropology department at Leiden University. That's here, for those who are wondering, in this funny little country of the Netherlands. And my co-author is Justus Uitermark. That's one of those Dutch diphthongs, who is a professor of geography and sociology at the University of Amsterdam, which is right next to Leiden. That's us. I'm the taller one of the two of us. And yeah, we've been working together since I was a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, which is 6 years ago now when I started there. So we've been working on these issues pretty much since the beginning of our cooperation. And here's what I wanted to cover in today's talk. So we have, I'm going to quickly introduce the findings and the arguments and so on that I'm going to introduce, that I'm going to talk about. I'll give a little bit of theoretical and some methods background. Then I have kind of two substantive headings. One is Instagram and the self, one is Instagram and the city. And then I have a couple of points for discussion to just throw in. Since we have a lot of liberty as far as the format is concerned, I was planning on doing like 40 minutes talking, because anything more than that I think is a little brutal in this online setting. But I'm very happy to be interrupted. So however the easiest way to do that is, please go ahead and ask questions in between. I think that's that only makes sense. Yeah, and the reason why this is a special title is because a book of this title, or at least a very similar one, will be coming out with OUP next year. Justus and I just signed the contract I guess like 2 months ago now. And we're just finishing up the last two chapters. So like I said, we've been working on this for 6 years. So this feels like a very nice way to bring this this long collaboration project to at least a close for now. Yeah, like I said, I'll try to keep it to about 40 minutes, but please feel free to jump in, and I think maybe just speak, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to see anybody's hand up or anything in this setting. So to introduce, I would like to go back to about 2015, which is when Justus and I started working on these issues. And in 2015, we had both pretty much absorbed kind of Manuel Castells on communication power. We were very much under the impression still of Gezi Park and Occupy and the Arab Spring, and we were starting a research project with colleagues in Norway at the time on cultural conflict. And the idea was that we wanted to study how social movements and cultural conflicts unfold, and we wanted to do so through social media data. And I think already in 2015, there was a sense of the Twitter thing having been done to death, that so many of the studies being based on Twitter data, looking at what happens on Twitter, and I think already Zeynep Tufekci at the time had pointed out some of the issues with relying so much on this single source of data, which is a relatively small platform with relatively strange users. I think I'm allowed to say that, being one of them, and so we wanted to look elsewhere. And I remember we had a planning meeting, and Justus came to me and said, "Have you ever heard of Instagram?" And I said, "Yes, I had an account there, but I was really bad at taking pictures, so I deleted it again." He said, "Yeah, that might be an interesting place to look, because it looks like something that people just use in their everyday lives. So if we want to study how social movements and cultural conflicts kind of bubble up and become salient and so on, that might be a nice place to look." So we started looking at Instagram. We started collecting data there, which at the time was still possible through the API. And when we started analyzing some of the first tranches of data that we were collecting, we were we were surprised because coming from the background of Castells and wanting to look for contention and people getting into debates about stuff and so on, I've been told many times that I was very naive to expect to be able to find that on Instagram, and yeah, it was quite naive. And what we found instead is that, what people do there tends to be kind of ensconced in positivity and affirmations of the status quo and so on, rather than any outright expressions of critique. I think maybe that's become a little bit more common these days with things like blackouts for in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. But yeah, what we were seeing by just looking at this data that we were collecting was that it wasn't going to be a very good source to be able to look at the kinds of issues that we were thinking about. But instead of then saying, well, let's forget about it and let's go back to Twitter like everybody else, we said, well, then this is actually quite interesting. How come, when you're surprised about something, that's usually a good indication. If surprised about something, especially in light of existing theory, it's a good indication that there's something to be learned, something to be discovered there. So we thought that by looking at Instagram, we would be able to tell a different kind of story about what social media are, what they do, what they mean, and so on. So that's what we began at the time. And our first kind of hunch was that the way to look at social media sites, especially one like Instagram, is to look at it in terms of status competition, because so much of what we were seeing seemed to revolve around status. And I'll get a little bit into that, what we mean by that geographically and sociologically speaking. So we took up a couple of new questions as we were looking into this. So what kinds of social settings are social media when we look at Instagram? What is it, why is it, and how is it that people post and use the platform? What kind of social structures do they create by interacting with other people there? And what kinds of politics can we actually find there? So clearly not the kinds of politics that Castells talks about in terms of rebellious individuals being able to assert their autonomy and so on, but maybe other kinds of politics do play out there. So that's what we also wanted to look at. And yeah, we didn't just kind of do this entirely inductively. We kind of went back between theory and looking at data. And one of the big kind of conceptual breakthroughs for us was to realize that so much of the existing literature that we were drawing on was looking at social media as a kind of coffee house setting, right? A place where people are gathering around texts that they share in common, tweets, news articles, whatever it is, and kind of living out this public sphere idea. And that, that the exchanges that people have there are, you can understand in terms of more or less reasoned debate around these shared texts. and that really didn't seem to fit very well what we were seeing. And so we started thinking instead, well, what if we, instead of using this metaphor of the coffee house and the networked public sphere, we think about it in terms of a space that more explicitly revolves around social status. And the kind of the starkest example of that is the absolutist court, and where everything revolves around the figure of the absolutist ruler, the monarch, and all the courtesans try to, you know, get as close to that figure as possible to affirm their social status. And there's one sociological classic that was very helpful for that. This guy Norbert Elias, or Elias, as the English speakers say. One of his earliest books was called The Court Society, and its analysis of what happened in the absolutist court of Louis XIV. And so we kind of mined this text for some ideas for how we could understand the kind of interactions that play out on Instagram. Roughly speaking, yeah, we kind of thought in terms of Elias's approach always is to look at the mutual constitution of social structures, or what he calls figurations, and the sensibilities of the day, so the kinds of subjective orientations that people have. And he singles out some of the hallmarks of a social space that really revolves around social status. And these are, here we summarize some of them. So there's structural pressures like mutual monitoring, right? Always being in each other's purview, which is what the absolutist court afforded by putting everybody in the same place. No private or private-public division to speak of, distinction to speak of. You know, people didn't really have a public, private room to withdraw to. And then a very explicit system of rank, a stratified system of rank, where you could see, okay, this courtesan gets to stand so close to the ruler, to the absolutist ruler during this ceremony, so that means this is the rank that they have. And when you have these sorts of structural pressures, then we can expect certain kinds of manners and sensibilities to result from that. One is a disposition towards engaging in decorous status displays. Elias's analysis of this for the French court is really wonderful. He talks about all the different fashions that came and went as people try to set themselves apart. You know, ever more colorful forms of clothing and so on. There's also a disposition towards predation, towards preying on one another, finding vulnerabilities, especially in those who are just above or below oneself in the system of rank. And then all kinds of anxieties and desires that come along with this for, you know, anxieties about social decline, desires for and aspiring to rise up, and so on. So this is this is kind of roughly the model that we've been looking at Instagram through, making a move away from the idea that Instagram can be understood as a kind of network public sphere, and seeing it more like this kind of system that revolves around rank and status. And in terms of the methods that we've employed, I think this is where this might be interesting, especially for those of you who maybe don't care about Instagram, but about how to do kind of cultural analysis nowadays. I think there's a lot of points of contact between what I've read about your center or your lab and what we've been doing. So yeah, in the early phases, we were collecting Instagram data through the API. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of data set we were able to build. And then we used computational analysis to look at that, especially network analysis and geographic analysis, networking, mapping essentially. And I think progressively as we were carrying on this project, like I said, over about 6 years now, we started looking more and more actually qualitatively. So we took the results of the network analysis as a way to find people to speak to, and we took the results of the geographic analysis to find places to hang out in, to do observation. We collected data in Amsterdam and in a couple of other cities, but our research is really focused on here. So it's not just a very distant kind of, looking through a microscope as a detached observer thing, but we're really studying the environment that we ourselves live in, that we move around in. And so we can also kind of have an awareness of changes that are happening and so on. So yeah, I think over the course of the project, we did close to 100 interviews and long-term observation in a lot of different places that are visible on Instagram, to see how that visibility expresses itself and also affects those kinds of places. So yeah, the book is Instagram, the Self, and the City. I think our Instagram and the City stuff is we've published a number of years ago now, and that's probably the stuff that our work is most identified with, and that we also maybe are the most confident about. But there's this other aspect, like I said, where we also want to look at the kinds of sensibilities that emerge. And there's 2 chapters in the book that deal with this idea of that, people really construct their self through the use of Instagram. One group that we look at are high centrality users in Amsterdam. So these are not necessarily people with a ton of followers, but these are people that have a lot of local engagement. So they have a high in degree in the network analysis. That might be brokers, so they might have a relatively high betweenness centrality. And for the most part, they're people whose livelihood to a certain, or at least their standing in a social scene depends on their Instagram use. So for them, we were interested in, finding out more about how do they perceive Instagram, what kind of a presence is in their lives, what importance has it had in their biography, and so on. And then the second group that we've looked more closely at are Instagram feminists. And actually, that's the group I want to talk a little bit in more depth about today. And for the most part, also the Instagram feminists were Amsterdam-based. So let me just. And the Instagram feminists are also, of course, interesting for us because we want to know kind of what do politics look like if we rarely or almost never have expressions of rebellious individuals asserting their autonomy and so on, as we were led to believe, then what kinds of politics do actually take shape there and are lived out through Instagram. So for this project on Instagram feminists, we did 25 interviews with co-author Laura Savolainen from Finland. And they were aged 18 to 37. And the way we compiled the sample is by finding people in our data that we had collected through the API that use the term feminist either in their bio or as a hashtag or in the captions of their images. So these are very just everyday users that affiliated themselves with Instagram in their everyday Instagram use. They're not people that are necessarily figureheads for big hashtag campaigns or something like that. And then after that accounts for about half of the interviews. And then there was some snowball sampling, which usually led to some of these more high profile users. So there's a kind of mix between everyday users and more people who are more closely identified with their feminist identity. Even though we kind of seeded from a European city, the actual sample is way more diverse. 12 different nationalities and about a third of the users are non-white or non-foreign born. They all have a very high level of education though. And So these interviews really give a very interesting insight into how the kinds of strains that these self-affiliating feminist users feel as they interact with the platform, but also how it benefits them and how it maybe even reconfigures their feminism. So the first example is Saga, who is a plus-size model from the Netherlands who immigrated to the US. And let me see, I can't actually see my screen, my whole screen. And she told us that, yeah, for her, feminism was actually a kind of competitive advantage. So she says, about a year ago, I was having a conversation with another model, and as she was like, it's really important to show on your Instagram who you are as a person. If you want to get booked to bigger jobs, you also want to, they also want you because you are a certain person, because you love certain things. That was when I decided that feminism is a big part of me, so it should also be a big part of my social media. It has been successful so far. My bookers like the image I put on my Instagram. So in this case, yeah, like I said, feminism is almost a kind of competitive advantage, something to affiliate oneself with. Another user, Josephine, she told us that any kind of success that women have is in itself inherently feminist. So to put that on display, to show that one is successful, as she did here in this post that she allowed us to reproduce, then that is a feminist expression. So any time that things are going well for you and you publicly share that, that's inherently feminist. And so in that sense, also Instagram is really making a sort of feminist project possible. So these are forms of what we call enhancement that Instagram offers for certain kinds of feminist projects or forms of expression. Not everybody is quite so positive about it though. So Erika told us that Instagram is so visual, you have to show yourself all the time. And it makes for a feminism or an activism that is so centered on your own body and not on your thoughts always. I do think it's difficult because I find that what I want to say really fits badly with the platform. Now, Erika is a socialist feminist, I guess you could say. I think that's how she described herself. So she finds it much more important not to celebrate individual achievement of individual women like Josephine, but to say something about social structures more broadly and to formulate a kind of more fundamental social critique, which she finds works very poorly on Instagram. So in this case, her preferred feminist expression is not enhanced, but it's actually diminished by having to find a form on Instagram. And then more often than not, we found a sentiment like this expressed by Erika. So people like when you achieve something. Instagram is very much about individual achievements and competition in a way that is difficult to combine with feminism. I try to counter that, but I also see that it goes against the way the medium is created. I always get the most response and engagement on pictures of myself. But then I also realize that sometimes to get a political message across, I have to be in the image myself. I struggle with Instagram as a platform a lot. So I think a lot of Instagram users feel this way, that they struggle. And you can see here in these images that, again, she allowed us to reproduce that the way that she tries to reconcile this, on the one hand, she doesn't want to put herself in the center. She doesn't want to individualize in the way that Instagram seems to demand. But on the other hand, she does want there to be engagement. So she does have to show herself, and she tries to decenter herself by not putting herself in the very center of the image, and by calling attention to other things that are going on, collectives that are around here, literature that she's reading, friendships that she's celebrating, and so on. And let me see. Sorry, I forgot my discussion summary slide here. But what we our kind of takeaway from this is that obviously people are using Instagram for political expression, but the way that they express it is, for example, here in the example of Erika, through a kind of minute deviation from what the standard visual idiom of Instagram is. So usually the idiom is, this is me, I'm successful, look at me. And she takes that recognizable idiom, but tries to tweak it somewhat so that she decenters herself, so that it's not just about herself. It has to be about herself. She is kind of compelled to put herself on display, but she also tries to decenter herself to a certain extent. And that's a kind of minute deviation through which her politics can find expression, even on this individualizing and very visual medium. So that's to give you a flavor for what that section of the book is about, that deals with Instagram and the self. A lot of it is about strains and struggles and the ways that people's sense of themselves influences how they use Instagram, but also how their Instagram use acts back on that and changes their identity really over time. Yeah, like I said, the other part of our work that has really been, I think, judging by citations, what we're better known for in a way is on Instagram and the city. And the book has two different chapters on that, which are not repeating what's in already published work, but these are generally new chapters for the book. And the first is called Integration and Conformity, and it looks at processes of subcultural differentiation and integration in Amsterdam and on Instagram. So again, trying to bring together the online and the urban and looking at the interface between those two. And the second one, called Staging Status, is a study of a single street, which actually not too far from my house here, in a gentrifying neighborhood, where we want to understand through interviews with local residents and business owners how online activities and kind of the online attention economy shapes processes of urban change, how certain places fare better or worse as a result of being able to gain visibility on Instagram. For the sake of time, I'll just focus on this first of the two chapters, Integration and Conformity, also because it shows, I think, our computational methods most clearly. So Integration and Conformity. This uses our data set that we were able to compile when access to the API was still possible. I still get emails sometimes from people asking, how did you do it? Can I do it? And I always have to say, sorry. I'm sure you've all been there. Instagram no longer permits this kind of access to data. And we wouldn't be able to recreate this at this point. And of course, this data is at this point somewhat dated, but we're trying to not just document current trends in Instagram, but to make a more fundamental point, I think, about social media. So we're not so worried about the fact that this is now some 5 years old. The data set consists of 700,000 and some posts. Those are not all posts that happened in this half-year period, but only posts by people that posted at least twice 2 weeks apart. So because we were interested in residents. Amsterdam, of course, gets a lot of tourists who do their one-off post from the canals or something. But we wanted to get mostly local residents and see how they use Instagram. And those local users, there are about 78,000 of them, which is almost a tenth of the Amsterdam population. We only have about a population of 800,000. We also collected all likes and comments on those posts, 34.4 million altogether. And then if we look at just those likes or comments that are reciprocated between these 87,000 users, then we find that there's 103,000 such mutual ties, right? If I like your post and you like mine, then we're considered to have a tie. And that's how we were able to construct a network of all the Amsterdam Instagram users. And that's the basis for our network analysis. So in the early phases, we were very much inspired by, I think, this classic of computational social science. I think I don't have to, everybody probably recognizes this, who's done some reading in computational social science, as a classic analysis of the political blogospheres. This is even pre-social media, which shows clearly a polarization in the political blogosphere between Democrats supporting and Republicans supporting bloggers. And so very similarly, we used network techniques in the beginning as we were looking at this network data that we got through Instagram to look for basically segmentation happening on Instagram into different subcultures, different clusters, and so on. And we found plenty of evidence of fragmentation. So if we look at this network that I just described of the almost 130,000 mutual ties between these 78,000 or so nodes, we find that it has a relatively high modularity of 0.6. If we apply a community detection algorithm, namely the Louvain algorithm, this is before the Leiden algorithm was published, then we find that there are clearly distinguishable clusters of users, 31 of them consisting of at least 200 users. If we study those members of those clusters, we can see that we can characterize them as having somewhat distinct profiles. And in addition to that, we're even able to find that these clusters are embedded in different zones within the city, meaning sets of places within the city, by looking at a place co-occurrence network. So this is all evidence of some form of fragmentation or segmentation going on, of the idea that, because social media affords assortative ties, we can kind of withdraw into bubbles of places, people that are like-minded to us, and so on. And there's also the worry that in the city that's then reproduced in the sense that there are different lifestyle zones that become and that even leads to segregation between different kinds of population groups. However, we felt a little bit dissatisfied with just drawing the conclusion that people are fragmented or that there's segmentation happening, because we also found countervailing tendencies to fragmentation. We found plenty of evidence also for actually integration taking place. So even though we were able to find these distinct clusters, and even though the modularity in the network was quite high, actually 2/3 of mutual ties span across clusters and are not within clusters. So even a modularity of 0.6 means that you have a lot of interactions and mutual interactions happening outside of those clusters that are detected. What's more, when we just kind of look at the spatial footprint of the clusters, we find that none of them are really completely distinct in the city. So there's also no sign that there's really spatial segregation going on in any strong way. A lot of them have very similar converging spatial footprints. Also, if we look at the level of places, we find that there's hardly a single place in the city that is only tagged by people from one cluster. Most places are tagged by people from different kinds of clusters. And that's reflected in the low modularity of the place co-occurrence network. So even though there are distinctions that we can find within the network, it's also quite clear that there's quite a lot of integration that happens that is made possible by Instagram. And so in light of our theoretical framework, which looks at Instagram as or social media more broadly as a site for status competition where people confront each other in a system of rank that is quite uniform. This is actually a quite interesting finding. And so we argue that yes, social media do enable bubbles to form, but they are also vehicles of integration that bring people into the purview of distant others. So we shouldn't just see, oh, my community detection algorithm finds that these people are in different clusters, because even if they are in different clusters, they might still very well be aware of each other and be watching each other and maybe even be kind of policing each other. And this being in each other's purview, this mutual monitoring that takes place, results in pressure to conform. And we conducted interviews with people in different kinds of establishments, cultural establishments, nightclubs, gay clubs, bouldering gyms, different kinds of places that are more or less visible on Instagram, and found that Instagram visibility for a lot of these places is really quite double-edged, and it's particularly hurtful for deviant subcultures. So for the bar that is usually the first bar for a newly out gay Amsterdamer to go to, they actually have an explicit ban on smartphones because they know that visibility hurts them, right? And that visibility results in this kind of pressure that is poisonous to their subculture that they're trying to keep alive. And so this integration and this moving into each other's field of visibility results in a pressure to conform. And that's why a lot of places actually try to develop some kind of strategies to ward off this kind of visibility that is promulgated through devices. All right, so that's a kind of preview of our arguments in that section of the book. More broadly, the book is kind of centered around three main arguments. One of them I just try to outline for you, which is that Instagram is a force for integration. It has this effect of bringing people into each other's purview, even across lines of identity or subculture and so on. That it thrives on inequality. I didn't really talk about that so much, but we have network measures to show that. Also, our geographic analysis quite strongly gets at that. Happy to go into details. And then, especially on the basis of qualitative data from these interviews that we conducted, we find that it really promotes conformity because of this kind of normalization through the gaze of the other that is transported through it. And so these are three central arguments in the book. In addition to that, there are kind of three larger debates about, what are social media and what are they doing with us. So the first, I think, is maybe somewhat pedestrian at this point, which is just the idea that we challenge the idea that social media are disruptive or somehow inherently disruptive and emancipatory. Though we still get pushback for that, so it's not that widely accepted yet. Then a challenge to the framing of social media as constituting a networked public sphere, and that's how what people do in social media is to be understood, that they're brought together around a shared text, broadly understood. And then finally, a challenge to the kind of recently more dominant echo chamber or filter bubble narrative, which holds that people do get sorted out into different clusters or different bubbles based around their shared interests because of the assortative ties that they can form. So again, that's something that we challenge by saying we also need to look at the countervailing forces that push towards integration. If you want to follow up on any of these things that we said, we do have some things published already, previews of the book. You can actually find these also on my website, which is at this location. So thanks for your attention. I think that was about 40 minutes. I look forward to your questions ideas, criticisms, and what have you. I'm going to stop screen sharing here.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we're back in the plenary. Yeah, thank you very much. This was super inspiring. There was already a question in the chat, which I may get to in a second. Also thank you very much to everybody who joined us on the way. So we have indeed about 1 hour and 15 minutes to discuss both your talk or wherever it takes us. So there is 2 questions. Maybe I just open it for that. Does it make sense? So the first question is from Andres Carius, and I think he just may want to speak up, I guess.
Oh, shall I read out the question? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Interesting talk. Yeah, I was just wondering about like the arguments that were based on the clustering of the network. So your argument is that there is wait, what was it exactly? Anyway, it relies on like the modularity statistics. So like and the integration statistics. So like are different clusters connected, and then you build an argument of that. But what I'm wondering is like, you know, it's just a clustering. So if you run the same algorithm with different parameters, or if you run a different clustering algorithm, then you would get different clusters and the different number of clusters, and then your integration statistics would immediately change. So I'm just wondering how strong of a basis do you feel that this creates for an argument?
Yeah, thanks. That is true. So I mean, both especially the Louvain algorithm is a stochastic. I never know how to pronounce that technique. So it uses a random number generator. So it depends on how it's seeded, and so indeed every time you run it, you get different results unless you fix the seed, and then of course, yeah, things like if we get different outputs, then some of these numbers change. So the modularity statistic is based on multiple runs of, kind of an average of multiple runs of the community detection. And also the statistic that 2/3 of ties occur between clusters rather than within is also based on multiple runs. So it's not just a one-off result, but we ran it multiple times with, with differently seeded
I'm sorry, I'm actually not talking about different seeds. I'm talking about like if you would use a different algorithm or the same algorithm with different parameters, then you would get a different number of clusters. So you might, from what I could see from the plot, you had like probably like 5 or 7 clusters. If I try to replicate the result, maybe I use a different algorithm, like a DB-scan or whatever, and maybe I get 2 clusters, and then my statistics for these links would be widely different.
Yeah, if you use a different algorithm, you get a different result. If you use a different resolution parameter, in the case of the Louvain algorithm, you would get a different result. And I mean, our point is not so much to say like, it's not meant to be a reproducible result in that sense. The point is more to say given these common parameters that we used, there is still kind of room for a different explanation. There's still room for countervailing tendencies. So yeah, I think we can pick apart the specifics of the numbers I listed, but it's more about the overarching point. So there's kind of how we interpret the results of a community detection, for instance, depends on what premises we go into it with. And if we have the premise of yes, people segment into different clusters, then we're going to ignore the evidence that goes against that, which is the fact that, for example, there are ties that go between different clusters, not just within clusters. So there is no strong kind of bubble formation that happens. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I'd like to underscore something which I think is important, which is this whole clustering, right? it's very hard to sort of like be better than like random walks. And so modularity, Levin, Newman modularity, this family of clustering algorithms has been used a lot, and they have become sort of mainstream due to like being integrated in GFI and stuff like that, where typically people hit the button once and then sort of like report the result. So if you ran that multiple times, that is sort of good practice with this particular method. And one of the interesting things is indeed that the sort of overlap of the clusters is sort of the flip side of the coin, which is also important to report. And I think there is a really, really interesting thing, like however you touch this, right? Is indeed, of course, you could use other stochastic block models, DB-scan or whatever. There's hundreds of pages of different algorithms. But I think touching it the way you touched it is not, you can defend in a stronger way, in essence. Of course, there's different ways to see it, but I think the result you get to is actually super interesting. That particularly you have no overlap, you have a lot of overlap sort of within the city. So basically, different stuff happens in the same places, and sort of different places, have come together in being sort of related to the same stuff. And I think that is a super important thing. And also, one question I would have is not, while you're looking at these clusters are representing people, right? It's like, there's some people who maybe, probably the majority, is monotopic on Instagram. So they either are sort of like in the gay crowd, or they are, I don't know, into bookshops or whatever. So how many are of these people actually appear in multiple of these communities? And what is actually the relation there? And so to put this in another way, talking about clusters, you're talking about rectangles along the diagonal of a matrix of connectivity. And there is some interesting stuff happening off that diagonal. And so the question is, what is the shape outside of the diagonal? What is the interesting stuff that you were surprised by, that you saw? Like that is something which would be really, really interesting to me.
Yeah. So thanks for offering a more a stronger rebuttal, I guess. I don't have a physics, math, anything background, so I am somewhere between the person who clicks once and the person who has read the papers. I have read the papers, I just didn't understand what was going on, so that's kind of where I am. And I do write the Python code with the parameters in it, so that I know what is driving those results that I'm getting. To the other question. So what are the surprising things that go on? So I mean, really, that none of these clusters that you find are completely self-enclosed. So, I mean, you find all the stereotypical stuff, right, of people that are just all about the coffee places and the latte art and so on. But even they then will have mutual ties with people that are like go into the big concerts at the arena, the believers, as we call them. So there's kind of ties that go between all these different kinds of subcultures that are represented on Instagram. So that's why the idea that you're just associating with like-minded people, and your stuff is only being seen by people who kind of share the same worldview as you is just not true. If we take into account that there's these much longer chains of interdependence, as we call them, drawing on Elias, that also operate, that also manifest in people's lives.
So last question in this direction: if you are assuming, okay, let's use this method. I find clusters I can name. So one question I have is like, how many clusters do you find that look good as clusters, but you have a really hard time putting a name on?
Yeah, that is definitely something that happens. So I think in this case, I remember relatively clearly. So like I said, we kind of used a cutoff of 200 users to characterize the clusters. There was 31 of them, and I think I was able to put a pretty confidently put a label on all but 3 of them. So, but that's still like almost 1 in 10 that is difficult to characterize. And then I mean, the other thing is we tend to characterize clusters in terms of who their most central users are. I think that's kind of become again the kind of state of the art in terms of how to do this. So you look at, you know, who are the central nodes, look at them, and then look at some of their neighboring nodes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that even the most peripheral nodes within that subgraph of that formed by that cluster will also neatly line up with how you characterize that cluster. So it's fuzzy, you know.
You are basically saying all French like baguette and croissant.
yeah, that's a little bit what happens, I think. So I think it's good to have that humility and to say, yes, my clustering algorithm finds X, Y, Z, but you know, so much of how we then interpret that depends on what our assumptions are going into it. So if our assumption is people form filter bubbles, echo chambers, people segregate and segment and so on, then we're gonna find evidence for it pretty much inevitably. But yeah, but there's plenty of reasons to look for countervailing tendencies. Does that answer your question enough?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, cool.
There's another question by Antonina.
May I ask a question concerning this topic? One more.
Sure.
Yes. So basically, my question is, it is related to what Andres was talking about, but maybe a step back actually. It relates to the way how you construct your network. Mm-hmm. As far as I understand, your network is you have a link in your network. If you have comments in both directions for two
comments or likes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Comments or likes, okay. And as far as I remember, you have like average degree of something like 3 or 4 of your nodes. So you have 78,000 of nodes and like less than 200,000 links. Is it correct?
2, yes.
Yes, that's about the order. Yeah. The edges are also weighted.
Edges are also weighted. Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is basically this. It looks, well, obviously it is not the only possible way of creating edges. Yes, because there are, I'm not very familiar with Instagram, but I believe there is some sort of subscriptions or something like this. Over there you can make directed links if there is likes in one direction, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah.
And your way of doing it makes it a very sparse network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you have an average degree of, if you divide one by another, you have an average degree of 3 or so. So my question number 1 is, how big is your giant component in your network?
Mm-hmm.
So do you have isolated nodes? Do you have isolated clusters of nodes or something like this?
No, it is one component.
It is exactly one component. So out of 78,000 people, there is no one who is not connected to anybody. It's a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit strange. Yes.
Yeah. No, I understand what. Yeah. Now I'm wondering whether. It's been a while. Now I'm wondering if I selected the largest component.
So that number, so let's assume that the largest component is probably something between 80–90%. So if you get a large chunk,
yes, it would be reasonable. And the related question is, what is the distribution of the degrees? So probably because in social networks you usually have a very wide distribution of degrees. Yeah. So probably there, even if the average is 3, there probably should be quite a bit of nodes which are almost unconnected.
Yeah.
And therefore, well, based on this, it is a question related to what Andres said. If you do it differently, if you construct the network in some other way, will you see, generally speaking, the same results, or will it not be possible? That is a technical question. I have some others, but
yeah. No, I understand. I think I understand your question. So we did use also the directed network, which, like you say, is less sparse because you throw out a lot when you only look at reciprocated ties, of course. And that was for the purposes of doing basically centrality analysis, of finding who are the most who wins in terms of attention. That's kind of what you can see with the directed network. When you don't filter on what ties that are reciprocated. But in terms of the community detection, it seemed, where the premise is that the resulting clusters would identify to something like subcultures where people mutually identify with each other. It seemed made much more sense to use the undirected network, the reciprocated ties, as the basis for it. And I mean, as far as I recall, the Louvain algorithm breaks down pretty badly if you give it disconnected components. So yes, the results would have stunk. And now I think that actually there was a small number of smallest other component that was not the giant component that I probably disregarded, that I didn't report previously.
So this is a super fascinating discussion. So
yeah, it's a little bit technical, I'm afraid.
I hope you're not feeling like a chicken that's plucked apart. This is not our intention.
Not at all.
Actually, another question I have is in a sense less technical and more, but also related to this part. You mentioned several times that, well, there are connections between different clusters, and there is visibility from one cluster to another, etc., etc. And you put it in a way that there is, you shouldn't neglect the integration forces in action or something like this. That is what more like. But what I actually haven't understood, and I don't know whether you have some sort of idea or mental image of that or not, what are actually the forces and the why is it so? What makes these clusters interact with each other, or what, because what we hear indeed, especially recently, it is fashionable to talk about echo chambers and stuff like this. And what are those forces which make people, which make different clusters interact?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I would phrase the question a little bit differently, which is just, why is it that users monitor and interact with distant others, basically? So not just with people that are like themselves, that they end up in a cluster with. And I think our Elias model is meant to provide some rationale for that. So if people have a tendency towards trying to figure out, okay, where do people stand within the system of rank that I'm moving in this symbolic universe that I'm in, and of preying on other people's social position, of figuring out, okay, who's vulnerable, how can I move up or down in the status hierarchy, then that's a force for integration. We tend to think of integration as a good thing, but I think Elias is really good at pointing out like the dark sides of social integration, that there's like, as a result of which we feel controlled and we feel we feel a need to conform, and so on and so forth. And I think that's why people have far more far-flung habits of looking and of connecting with other people than we generally assume when we look at just echo chambers and so on. So people sort themselves into bubbles to a certain extent, but they also look at things much more widely than that. It's not just within people within their own little subculture, but also, like I said, the coffee aficionado looks at what the believers do and so on. So there's, I think.
I mean, it's a little bit, well, usually when you think of echo chambers, you think about politics, for example.
You think about politics, yeah.
Yeah, because it is a little bit strange to think of liking coffee, music, and being, I don't know, a fitness freak as a mutually exclusive things. Yes.
Yeah. No, they're not mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Yeah. So probably people have their Instagram selves which are more centered on one topic, but generally. In terms of these lifestyle things, I think it is natural to assume that people sort of squat on several positions. Also, by the way, what I wanted to know that if you have an average degree 3 or average degree 4, we understand that it is not a really good proxy of real social network. Yes, because we do interact actively with.
No, that's not how. Yeah, but that's not how we're looking at it as a proxy for a real world social network. It's very much the interface between the city and the platform.
Mike, thank you. There's other people who also.
Yeah. So should I address the question that's been sitting patiently in the chat?
Next, and then Mila. Thank you very much. But thank you very much, Mike. This was very, very useful.
So, Antonina, do you want to ask your question live or?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask maybe Mila's questions related to this thread now. I just would like to know why did you focus on feminists, or do you find that the feminists are the most prominent clusters on Instagram? So why did you choose them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thanks for asking it. So actually, yeah, they didn't stand out as a cluster at all in any of these analyses that we're talking about now. So so it's not a distinctive enough identity, at least at the city scale, to really stand out like that. But the answer is really, I mean, we wanted to be able to have long, in-depth interviews to really get at the fears and anxieties and so on, and the aspirations that drive people. And the only way to do that is by having a research assistant who is a participant observer. So we had a master's student, Laura, very capable social researcher, and she wanted to study this topic. So and she was able to get recruit interviewees very effectively. If you can imagine Justus and I sending DMs to people and saying, "Hey, we want to talk to you about Instagram feminism," wouldn't be happening. But Laura was able to do so very effectively because she was herself a kind of participant observer. So that's kind of a pragmatic reason. And but I mean, there's also a substantive reason, which is just that I think in the public discourse, very often, if we mention to people like, you know, if we look at Instagram, it's we have to change our idea of what politics on social media look like. People would very often say, yeah, but isn't the revival of feminism very much thanks to Instagram? So there's this public discourse, I think, that very much associates Instagram with feminism and therefore sees Instagram as beneficial to social movements. So we wanted to complicate that picture also a little bit, I think. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think there is actually a connection between the question before or the discussion before and this thing, which is you just gave a very good characterization that you're interested in a topic and you have justified reasons for it, where it doesn't actually resonate with whatever quantitative results you get out using a justifiable argument. If you would ask a network scientist 10 years ago or 8 years ago, they would have said use Louvain modularity clustering, right? And so now that is sort of an experience many humanists have when they work with, I certainly also had, when they work with different network scientists having different preferences for clustering algorithms, the sort of like algorithmic optimality or optimal result is very different from what we would consider rational when we look at the same data. And now there's a very interesting thing. And so I'm very thankful, Mike, that you brought up the kind of definition of the network, right? So obviously, if you have a sparse network, which is sparse means there's the minimum number of links that actually connects the clusters, which is by definition tree-like. So that means there is very little triangles, which means there is no clusters because that is counting triangles. So now there's a really interesting kind of notion going on. There's only some areas in the network where you have triangles, which are obviously around the most central nodes, which is actually why you end up with exactly your interpretation that French people like to get, and you cannot say anything about the tendrils. So this is a really interesting thing where sort of your result is connected to this kind of definition, which is not sort of devaluing your work, but it's an interesting opportunity to say, okay, so if this is like the standard thing people do, and this is the kind of stuff we get out, but qualitatively I get out something else when I do this interview thing, there is a question where we could say, okay, but what kind of quantification do we actually need in order to characterize the system more holistically in a more sense-making way that actually also captures what I find qualitatively? And there's an interesting kind of development happening, which I also mentioned to the group right now, actually earlier today, which is this high order network kind of stuff, where we look at like multiple definitions and sort of like more than just the links. And I think that is a really, really interesting kind of direction to look at, particularly regarding these kind of things, where one could actually also look at the sort of things that may look like clusters if you look at the system in one way, but don't look like clusters in another way. So the question is, can we filter and squint like an owl at feminism and actually see it nevertheless? And it may be fuzzy, which is not a problem, right? I mean, there's fuzzy things in life, like there is colorful blobs in water that dissolve and there is no boundary, but nevertheless the blob is there. And I think that is a really interesting sort of notion where I think this discussion is really interesting because John brought in qualitative insights and Mike sort of like, and Andres actually came from a more algorithmic and sort of like, Mike more not algorithmic, but sort of, sort of formal applied math definition side. And these things actually complement each other and need to be taken into account. And I think that, I hope this becomes clear to everybody, even though we don't have a solution, and may not have one for 2 years, actually the confluence of these things allows us to describe a system better than to say, but you don't cover my thing, and the other person says, like, you don't cover my thing. I think that is sort of something what's the grand challenge of cultural data analytics that is ahead of us. That's just my comment. So I like this discussion a lot. Mila had a question, I think.
Yeah, well, my question kind of like is actually related to your comment, but I see that Miro Lee was asking if he could be the next. Maybe his question is related to the previous discussion so that I can continue after that.
Yes, Miro, you want to speak?
It's all right. Can you hear me, Joe? Thank you. And something I want to ask you about your methodology. And it seems you mentioned that your inference is about their age is between 17 to 18 to 70 to 37. I mean, it's a long range. I mean, how and why you confirm your inference, I mean, in this gap? Did you get me?
Yeah, I hear you.
All right.
So this was for the specifically for the part about the Instagram feminists. And like I said, the way that we recruited the interviewees for that was by drawing users from our platform data that either use the word feminism in their bios or in captions of posts, reaching out to those directly through DMs, and then supplementing that with snowball sampling. So basically having those interviewees recommend other people to talk to learn about what it's like to be an Instagram feminist. And there was no restriction on what age people could be, but this is just, I think, as a result of waves of feminism, who uses Instagram, and who we started out with, which is again relatively young Instagram users. That this is the age bracket that we ended up with. We also didn't talk to anybody under 18, just for ethics clearance reasons. So yeah, does that? So I think there was nobody who said we're not going to talk to anybody over 35, over 37, or anything like that. It was just
all right. I mean, you mentioned a lot of Instagram feminist, and how do you think about the difference and the similar between feminist or feminism and Instagram feminist and feminism in research?
In research, how do you mean? You mean like as a feminist perspective in research, or? Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting question. So, I mean, first of all, like the Instagram feminism that we, it had some aspects in common, but like I said, like there was the example of Josephine, who was very much into the celebrating individual achievements, kind of liberal lean-in feminism, if you want, versus others that were more socialist in their orientation. So there, it's not one kind of feminism. It's feminisms that are find expression on Instagram. And then what is the relationship between like having a feminist perspective and studying feminism? Is that what you're?
I mean, how do you understand the feminism and Instagram feminism? The relations.
Okay, I understand.
Okay.
So this was a question that we got also in peer review, like, how can you claim to be saying something about feminism more broadly when you're really just saying something about what people do on Instagram? But I think, something about this moment where what people do on Instagram has a lot to do with feminism, of course, because that's how it's publicly perceived, and that's how it's, but of course, on the other hand, there is a lot of feminine, like the global women's strike, is not an Instagram phenomenon, but Me Too is. So, and one is a Western, mostly Western phenomenon, and the other one is. So, I mean, what you end up seeing through Instagram of contemporary feminism is quite selective, and so that's why we're careful to specify that we're not saying anything about contemporary Instagram as a whole, but contemporary Instagram as filtered through Instagram. And partially that filtering, like I said, kind of enhances certain kinds of expression. So certain liberal feminisms, they do very well. Also sex positive feminism generally does very well. Other kinds of feminism don't lend them, they're not communicated very effectively through Instagram.
All right. I mean, from my personal understanding, I think right now the border of the reality of the society and the virtual reality, they are engaged online. Sometimes I'm thinking of how to say it. Right now, people, let's say, by this topic, feminism, and people online, especially the Instagram user, they started to abuse the name of feminism. How do you think about this?
I think, one of the premises of our research is that, everyday Instagram use is just part of everyday life. And so it doesn't really make sense to distinguish very heavily between this is real life and this is
All right.
virtual life or something like that, because I think as our both our city-related research and our self-related research tries to make clear, it's nothing is ever just online or just virtual,
right.
because it reconfigures the self, it reconfigures the city. It has very
right.
material consequences right away. So I mean, like half the bars in my neighborhood wouldn't exist if not for their visibility on Instagram. I think
right.
it has very direct material consequences. And similarly, you can imagine that certain forms of for certain political messages, they just
right.
wouldn't be circulating if not for their mediation on Instagram. So yeah.
Sorry.
Did I answer your question, or did I misunderstand it?
I think so. So for your personal understanding, you think feminism is equals everyday Instagram feminism?
Feminism is equal to Instagram?
Everyday Instagram. Sorry. So, okay, I'm fine.
Okay.
I want to give you some more time.
Thank you very much. So I do think this sparks a very interesting discussion, which has to do with the meaning of words. And so one interesting thing is like treating this as a humanist, one could have a discussion, like in a classic humanistic discussion, one thinks about coarse-grained concepts, and one could have a discussion about feminism in general versus Instagram feminism. But obviously, what we need to take into account is that, like John in his talk talked about not Instagram in general, but individuals on Instagram using or adopting the word feminism, often having different concepts. So there were even individuals who made a difference between, they said, Instagram is a problematic platform for me because on their platform means feminism means something different for me than in general. So the key thing is this kind of discussion, I think we should not polarize in that way. And it would be interesting to actually look at the dynamics of this. So there is actually evolutionary game theory about this, following Peyton Young and Andrea Borom-Kelly, which is about naming games, which is exactly about this issue, right? Like there's this thing or concept or activity we call feminism, or we think of, or where you think Alice Schwarzer thinks also about the same thing if you say the word feminism, and that is named feminism or not. And so there is a lot of dynamics going on in this area, and obviously this can be solved partially with this kind of research, partially with evolutionary game theory, partially with things like computational linguistics, looking at large corpora and so on. But I do think we need to be very aware that this is a very, very complex and complicated topic where we should not like sort of put speakers in a corner and say, you need this or you need that, because that basically polarizes the discussion. So let me follow up. So there is still, Mila is the next.
Yeah, actually, I really want to thank you for this wonderful presentation, and I'm really enjoying this discussion. It's kind of like coming from different disciplines and angles, and we're really thrilled about your topic. So I'm actually also, I wanted to ask, this is a kind of like continuation of what Miro Lee was talking about, and I'm also interested in kind of like, well, we can say that there are often phenomena that we're interested in. Then there are certain concepts that we used for kind of like trying to describe these phenomena that we are interested in. And then there is, of course, data and research methods that we somehow try to use in order to understand all these layers. So I was kind of like really interested in at the beginning of your talk, as you described that initially you were interested in looking at social movements and cultural conflicts, and to study them through social media data. And when you started to look at Instagram, you realized that actually maybe your initial research questions didn't kind of like really apply with the things that you saw within the data. So I'm just kind of like curious, because I'm myself right now in this kind of like situation that, well, I'm cultural historian and I'm interested in looking at how historical narratives are constructed within World Wide Web, and kind of like trying to do this translation from certain kind of like there is this phenomenon that I'm interested in, and then kind of like what kind of research methods and kind of like components I really need to focus in order to somehow distill the things that I then think represent this phenomenon that I'm interested in. So kind of like I would like to ask, perhaps you could talk a little bit about your kind of like way of thinking in kind of like looking at both the data and then kind of like selection of certain kinds of research methods and approaches. And then, I don't know, I have just another question as well, if you allow, just bombarding. But this is also somehow related to what was discussed earlier, kind of like this digitality and then the physical everyday life. And what I see from your presentation, that it's actually what I really like your research is that it's kind of like you are using both, and you are trying to understand how the physical, the city and the digital are kind of like entangled in a way. So that's also a thing that maybe it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts about, kind of like how do you see like specifics of certain kinds of like social media platforms and the entanglement of the physical kind of like city more broadly. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks for those questions, Mila. So about your first question, I think it's always a struggle. So I think I hope that you have colleagues and advisors telling you like so I so I teach a lot of research methods, right? And one of the things that I often tell students is I show them that supposed circle of inquiry, where you derive a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis and then you either confirm it or reject it, and based on that you refine your theory, and then the circle just keeps on turning. And I tell them that I hate that. Forget about the circle, because that's never how it works, right? And especially not when you're doing cultural social research, where very often the aim is discovery, right? The aim is to be surprised. The aim is not just to test existing theory, but it's also to generate theory. And doing that is often like doing something without handrails for the first time, right? Because you don't know, okay, it's not just a matter of taking this hypothesis and testing it, but it's letting yourself, interacting with the world and allowing yourself to be surprised and then seeing where it takes you. And I have to say that in this process that I just talked about over these last 5-6 years, one of the big things in this kind of iterative process that gave me some handrails was having a co-author who's not here today, but and the way that we often proceeded is, we had a kind of division of labor. I was the one working with the data. I would create maybe a table, maybe a plot, maybe a graph, a lot of visualization happening, which I know you're also interested in as a group, I understand. And then I would share that with my co-author, with Justus, and I would say, here, look, this is what I'm finding. Or I would say, here, look at these top 10 posts from the DAM, and really interesting, didn't expect this. And then we would kind of write memos to each other, and that would provide us with handrails for the process of inquiry. And I think this having this iterative process, if you have an iterative process, it's very important to write memos along the way. I mean, people that do grounded theory and in the social sciences do this anyway. But I think more generally, it's a useful process to say, okay, today I looked at this piece of data, or I read this theory, and this is what it had me thinking about. And then you slowly kind of make your way toward the target. And so I don't know, that's maybe a little bit abstract, but that's what I had to think of as you were asking the questions. So I know that in American sociology, it's become quite fashionable to invoke the name of Charles Sanders Peirce and his idea of abductive reasoning or abductive analysis, which is really about, it's kind of an alternative to either being inductive or deductive, you know, either just letting things emerge from the data or just testing hypotheses based on pre-existing theory, and somehow moving back and forth between the two. And I think that's really how most research progresses. And also in computational research, I think it's has a lot of relevance, this idea. And now I've talked about that, and I've kind of forgotten what your second question was. Could you just quickly give me a
yeah, I was asking about this connection between the digital and the physical, in a way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like what really helps is looking at specific contexts of use. And I think certain subdisciplines are very good at that. Digital anthropology, for instance, you know, ethnographies of how things are used within certain settings, where the material conditions under which certain digital technologies are used are very clearly described and very clearly made explicit. And some subdisciplines, not to pick on anybody, but they're not so good at that. Like, for instance, you know, the behavioral science idea of, you know, social science, social media, good for you or bad for you, you know, and it kind of decontextualizes and takes social, you know, kind of reifies social media as something that has this independent reality, and rather than looking at specific contexts of use and so on. So I think looking at studies that look at specific, that really look at how a technology works within a given context, that can be an urban context, an organizational context, what have you, that really helps to get a handle on how it interfaces with our material reality. Like, for instance, just to give an example, a book that I really like to teach with is The Ballad of the Bullet by Forrest Stewart. It's an ethnography of drill rap on the south side of Chicago. And he talks about how the aspiring drill rappers, how they're motivated by the attention economy of YouTube and other social media. And so it's not just saying, you know, what is it that social media are doing, but it's looking at a very specific context. And he finds that these emerging drill rappers, they try to figure out, okay, how can I get the most views on YouTube? Because it promises them a very high payoff. It promises them social mobility out of their context. So you're understanding how these systems work with it, given certain aspirations, given a certain kind of material reality and so on. So yeah, I said I teach in an anthropology program now, so I've really come to appreciate ethnography a lot because I think it gives you a lot of context, which is important.
Can you share that link to that book and
sure.
to your teaching, of course?
Yeah.
So I think I would like to reiterate like what you just said about like research methods, right? And so this is indeed something which we try to spread the message. There's different approaches that you can pursue, right? And beyond the kind of testing, experimenting, and so on cycle, there's indeed something in cultural research which, while we were in our little bubbles, the cultural science or cultural studies departments, nobody actually hindered us doing it. Basically, the kind of acting as surveyors, acting as sort of the astronomers of culture, but also like Humboldt, you know, doing sort of coincidental research when you're there, right? So if you stand beside a pond and there's electrical eels in there, you just have to grab one in order to test the electrical. You're there and you're the only thing that can measure it. And so basically, and then you walk on and you do plants at 3 p.m. And so that is something where things come together. And I think that is something which you've showed very well. And what we try to do here at CUDAN, I think that is sort of like a message that's sort of for all, is to actually find out what are the ways we can actually analyze culture. And not only analyze, we have artists that synthesize, do stuff that is not mainstream in the sense there's a paper or a book or something like that. There's other things coming out. But the interesting thing is all these different ways can be put together in pipelines. And sometimes once you have a theory that comes up the way you describe it, there is moments where you can use, for example, numerical modeling in math, or you can use machine learning in order to test, or you can actually set up, like, how would the experiment actually look like? Can we analyze and get a grip around that concept by doing that kind of more formal thing that takes us to nature human behavior or something like that? Because that is also important, because it can stand in itself when these different sort of notions sort of can work together. So that's sort of one goal I would love to see for the field as a whole. Obviously, nobody can do every one of these things, but that's actually why we should have these kind of conversations that are mixed together. So there is so lots of people ask questions already, but maybe somebody who hasn't asked, so if you have something on your mind and you haven't spoken yet, this is your time. Yes, so there's Ruta. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, and I started to think not more about the methods themselves used, but actually about maybe the problem researched here. So the analysis and also the interviews were mostly done in 2015 and 16, right? There's the mic off.
Not the interviews. The interviews are more recent.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the city analysis and that, and at least for me as a user, I feel that Instagram is, for one thing, is changing its algorithm, and also maybe because of that, or together with it, also our mind, how we use it, is changing a lot. So maybe what are your thoughts? How relevant are these conclusions now when compared to what is going on now?
Yeah, that is almost an inevitable question, and comes up a lot, of course, also you know, when with reviewers for the book and so on, and I think there's a big emphasis in so I'm just going to switch the view here so that a big emphasis, especially in research by media and communication scholars, on affordances, right? It's kind of a big buzzword these days. What are the affordances of Instagram for feminism, for instance, or and to say, okay, which assumes that there's something about how a certain system is designed that encourages certain kind of uses, and so the design decisions are really what it's about, and they're what shape the importance of the system within contemporary society or contemporary culture. And and if we were to center affordances, then of course it would be a big problem for us in a way that most people nowadays use Instagram, from what I understand from newer research, for stories rather than to curate their grid of images, which is what you resemble right now. And so you know, people post ephemeral things. They don't just post this public profile of themselves and how they want to be perceived and so on. And of course that's a big part of that's an important part of the analysis. But I think we're also trying to get at something. I don't want to say something deeper or more fundamental, but I think there's something about these kind of sociological mechanisms in terms of how people interact through a kind of system, regardless of the specific affordance, that is very important to understand its relevance for everyday life. So if we say that Instagram is a kind of almost is almost an emblem for a space where people are very status conscious all the time, but it's not explicit to Instagram, and that's why we sometimes fall back into saying and social media more generally, because we think there's something that we can learn about social media more generally by looking at Instagram, which does have this very strong focus on people's social status and so on. Our hope is that the book will have some shelf life, despite, like you say, some of these things being 4, 5, 6 years old, because we get at some relatively fundamental kind of sociological mechanisms. So that's my answer. Whether you find it convincing or not, well, I hope so.
Thank you.
I have a question, follow up to this. It's an excellent question, I think, actually also excellent answer. So we have seen certain things like Yahoo 360 going out of business. We have seen the Tumblr to Reddit exodus, the Twitter to Parler exodus and stuff like that. And so it begs the question not only what kind of platform should you analyze next, but could you do the same thing as in brain science, where you look at the same cohort of people? Like, for example, once Instagram sort of is out, would you be able to contact the same people who may still be feminists or not, and ask them similar questions when they probably spread out in multiple different platforms? Is that something you've thought of?
I think that's a really promising idea. I can't say that I've done it myself or that I've have any designs along that line, but I know that I think some people in the Digital Methods Initiative here at around Richard Rogers, they did something along those lines with following people that's deplatformed from Twitter to Telegram, I think, to see how their posting behavior changed after they did that. So I think it's been done. It does sound familiar anyway, and I think it was the DMI folks that did it. And of course, yeah, that would be, I mean, the people change, but you could assume that they're relatively constant, but then whatever difference in how they express themselves might have something to do with the affordances or with the environment that they find themselves in after migrating. So it would be very interesting. Yeah, but I can't say I have designs in that way.
Thank you very much.
But the PhD candidates in the room should listen very closely.
Okay, thanks. Yuna has the next question, I think.
Yes, thanks, Max, and thanks, John, for an excellent talk. I was actually, I guess, my question is in relation to Ruta's question about the change of affordances of the platforms. And I now cannot recall, well, how long was the period of data collection for your social network analysis work. But now I'm just wondering, and I'm not as familiar with the Instagram affordances history, but just thinking about it, perhaps there have been these some interesting changes to the platform during your data collection. And then if it was perhaps possible to see how the network has changed, let's say following that change of the affordance, and how perhaps specific affordances, then we could say, influence how people started connecting to one another. In my own work, I work with cinema industries and mostly doing social analysis of people working in film production. And there some, I guess, similar work could be looking at different policy changes in different countries. And I mostly look at gender and, how, let's say, following a policy change, perhaps the network is now connecting differently and how interacting differently. So based on that, I'm now just wondering if perhaps it was also possible to do a similar sort of, a side study with your Instagram data.
It's a great question. Yeah, you're kind of describing a natural experiment, I think is what the social scientists like to call it. So where there's something that's external to the process that you're studying that impacts the process or that you're interested in, and then you can see what impact that has and learn something about the system. But we did have something like that. So the period of data collection was relatively short because it was within a year of our starting to collect data that it was shut down for those uses. What did happen is, and we write about this in a short kind of intermediate reflection in the book, is that the way that geotagging worked changed during the time that we collected data. And the result of that was that people were much more likely to accidentally tag their location before the change than afterwards. I don't know if you recall this. This was the add to photo map feature, which could kind of be set to on and then be on, and then your images would be geotagged. regardless of whether you added a place tag or not. And one interesting thing that we can do with that is not look, so it is a kind of natural experiment in our data, but we use it not to look at how the network changes, but to see how the spatial distribution of posts changes. And what it shows, what it allows us to underline is an argument that I didn't really make explicit today, but which is that people tend to tag locations that are higher status much more than places that are of lower status. So we show the neighborhood level, especially. So people post, when people were posting accidentally, they posted more from kind of poor working class peripheral neighborhoods than they did afterwards when they had to explicitly opt in, to the point where some parts of the city were basically like wiped off the map, so to say, as a result of this change, because there was just no place that people really wanted to explicitly tag themselves to. So that's one thing that we were able to study through this. And I think, yeah, this kind of system drift, I think it's also called sometimes, is it can be promising, but I think the big problem is that we often don't really know when this kind of drift happens, right? So changes to the algorithmic timeline or something like that are often so subtle, and they're rolled out continuously. The old move fast and break things is just constantly in operation. So we don't really know when some of these design things change. So it can be hard to pinpoint exactly, this is my before and this is my after. But when it does happen, like a button getting added or removed from an app or something like that, then of course that can be a big opportunity. So the next thing to do is to get an in with somebody at Facebook and and ask them to roll out your own personal change, I guess.
I have a question which sort of is connected to this, but also loops back to the very beginning, which is Elias's court culture theory. Mm-hmm. And so that is a really interesting thing. So I've met people in life that roll on Elias's court culture in the art world. Has to do with art donors, which is very much a status culture. Mm-hmm. So there has been the observation that there is a new renaissance of global Baroque, driven by things, and this is very much sort of perceived by those who are in this status culture, as also by those who observe it from the outside, by saying, okay, we have inequality levels which sort of are equivalent preceding to World War II. But what most people don't realize is we're not seeing sort of the recurrence of the rise of fascism, as in Italy or in Germany, which went with better postal service and better train service. But we actually relive something that looks much more like 1620 in Europe, right? And so the key question is, how serious do you take this kind of notion of sort of using a theory that describes the 17th century or 18th century to actually describe the current situation? Is this just an iconographic fad that we like put a label on something, or do we indeed sort of witness a new global Baroque?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I used to always put, there's an Instagram account called Marie Antoinette Style that kind of, yeah, showcases how new fashion trends or new television shows that show people dressed up, basically like Marie Antoinette. And I used to always draw some images from there to adorn my slides about Elias and the court society, because it just seemed to make the case so perfectly. But then, yeah, I actually had the same idea. Like, I mean, we're using it as a kind of synchronistic model to understand certain pressures in a certain kind of situation, and in a way de-historicizing it, and not kind of as a more diachronistically. And but on the other hand, I do have to think of, like, always historicize, the Jameson mantra, and the idea that when you use a certain kind of theory, you also import a bit of history in. And I think you put your finger on it, that I guess that is the kind of history that we do want to allude to, that we do live in this new golden age, that we do, another great reference to understand a status focused culture is, Thorstein Veblen's what's it called? Well, the Conspicuous Consumption book. I'm blanking on the name right now. So, which is also, you know, from a previous period of high inequality and so on. And I think there's definitely something to that, but we don't make much of these kind of aesthetic continuities that you allude to. So I think it's something I would like to look at more in the future. But you know, how having such a culture of inequality transported and amplified by Instagram also amplifies certain kinds of aesthetic trends that recall previous periods of extreme inequality, which I think it definitely does. But I haven't done that systematically. I think maybe the artist.
Whoever organizes the workshop first invites the other, please.
Excuse me. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Maximilian, can I have a tiny comment on what you just said?
Yes.
I would say that probably, well, if we look at the history of early 20th century, it is important to notice that the rise of fascism comes after World War I, not before. And I think that probably more relevant period of comparison for the current level of inequality and the associated, well, political troubles is probably the Gilded Age, yes, the First World War period, when these pressures accumulated and ended up in this sort of thing. And only after that,
I fully agree. Thank you very much. I didn't want to get too deep into it. But you're right, of course, because, yeah, all the theory was done there, Pareto and all that. Yes. There is one completely different question in the chat, which is Mirror Lee. And so basically we are at 3:51. So maybe that's the sort of last question or second to last question. So whoever has the last question after that, like prepare it right now, okay? So Mirror, please speak up.
All right, and Joe, I'm sorry to say about your research, maybe probably it's because I didn't read all of your paper and your outcome I don't really agree with, and about your methodology, from a personal understanding, it's not the best one, but we think that, well, about this research, at the end of this research, does it give you any promotion, spark your opinion to do something more related to this topic in future? Can you hear me?
Yes, I heard you. I'm not sure I understand the question though. I'm sorry.
All right. First, I said about about the outcome of your research.
Yes.
I don't agree with most of them, and
you don't. Okay.
I don't agree with that. And about your methodology, I also don't think it's the best methodology to do this research. But for sure, it's just my personal understandings. I may follow this research, and at the end of this research, does it give you any promotion to, to spark your opinion to do something more in the future related to this topic?
You mean will having this book published give me a platform to do something else?
I don't really think so. For example, how to say that?
So may I interrupt?
Sure.
So you're basically saying you don't like the research, this is an opinion, and you say you're basically saying the author is, or the speaker is using the research to propagate their opinion, but you don't agree with their method. So you use an opinion to undercut research because you reject the reasoning of the research. So Hal Feyerabend once famously said, the job of the scientist is to be an anarchist who uses reason to undercut reason. So we cannot use opinion to undercut your opinion that the reasoning is not good. So the key thing is that we get your point, but I do think that it's not the point to sort of insult the speaker, if that makes sense, with an opinion.
No. I'm sorry. I don't have any intention to do that. I mean, basically, and I personally, I don't really understand no. I don't really agree with the outcome of this research. But I mean, probably because I didn't read the full article and your writing. I mean, how do you think, and do you have any opinion, and for your previous research of this one to promote your further research? I think Mr. CUDAN, I think you definitely have some misunderstanding of my opinion. I'm not like that. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think I don't understand exactly what you mean by promote. Like, do you think I'm now in a position to have other insights, or like?
I mean, okay. Let me insert. Let me insert. Let me insert. I mean, do you have any plan to do any further research follow this one?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Mila, you lifted your finger.
Yeah, I was just kind of like, well, the way I interpreted the question was that kind of like in what kinds of ways you are planning to continue from here, and and kind of like using these methodologies and so on. That's that's how I understood the question.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Yeah, good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So some of the other research I'm doing, well, I was doing until kind of being barred from doing field work for reasons, was to do kind of long-term ethnographic research in a specific neighborhood in The Hague. This was through the Center for Bold Cities that Professor Schich mentioned. And what we wanted to do there is what I was doing there for about 4 or 5 months before the lockdown happened and so on, was to hang out in the neighborhood regularly, talk to residents, hang out in community centers, and really try to understand how not just Instagram, but all kinds of digital media were being used by residents to essentially boost the image of their neighborhood. So this is a stigmatized neighborhood on the south eastern margins of the city. It's kind of often invoked in parliamentary debates as the place where you definitely don't want to live. And so the residents don't care for that stigmatization that much, and so they try to counter the stigmatization of their neighborhood. And so I wanted to understand how their uses of digital media, well, how they were going about it, how successful they were, whether they were able to even gain any visibility given the kind of status dynamics that I'm now quite attuned to, and so on. So that's one direction in which I've tried to develop this. I hope that, yeah. Good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for clarifying, Mila.
So I have an announcement to make, and but first I would like to thank the speaker today for this. This was a fantastic discussion.
Thank
we
you.
all
I
had
enjoyed
great
it.
fun, I think. So this is super cool. And this was a great opener for this season of CUDAN Open Lab Seminar. Next week, it's gonna continue with an equally great topic that actually may spark a similar discussion, which is Denny Vandricic, who was the initiator of Wikidata. That's a database part behind Wikipedia, who meanwhile worked for the Google Knowledge Graph, returned to Wikimedia Foundation, and actually now leads a project called Wikifunctions. And Wikifunctions, the function of Wikifunctions, so it will be in itself, is to sort of enable automatic translation. So there's a lot in the Dutch Wikipedia about a certain town, but not so much in Kiswahili. So you can actually use these translate functions to actually sort of create a larger article. And you can imagine this is at the same time wonderful because we can spread knowledge all across Earth. But if you've ever heard about the term colonialism, you know exactly how that works out. And so there is both dangers and really awesome things happening. And one other thing that is interesting, it not only enables functions such as, this word means the same thing in active as this other word in passive, it also allows mathematical functions. So this may actually be something that is super relevant for machine learning because we can do multiple other things with it. So, and this is sort of brand new, started in spring. And so I hope you join us for that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.